Where are you? Come to meet.
Oh, Father Frank, hi. I'm thinking of Gloria.
Yes. Yeah.
You went there recently, right?
No, I was supposed to fly the week everything closed down,
Okay.
and told her I didn't want to be on a plane, that I bring something with me that I'd leave with her.
Yeah.
So
It's about
we're
Gloria.
waiting.
Yeah.
We're waiting for the green light to be able to fly.
Yeah.
Denny,
Sally and John.
I'm going to interrupt people so we can get officially started.
Good.
Denny, you want to start with introduction to Johnny and we can introduce one another? Sorry, bad timing.
Well, the wrong way. Well, Johnny, one thing I just wanted to be sure, I think we've been pronouncing your last name incorrectly. And would you just say how you say it, please?
Sure. I was going to say there is no incorrect pronunciation. I've heard so many of them over the years. I'm not sure if I remember the correct pronunciation. My last name is Zokovitch.
Zokovitch. Okay. Well, welcome, Johnny Zokovitch. We're just so pleased to have this opportunity. And sorry. Most of you, I believe, received some information about Johnny's background on the material that Mary Ellen sent you.
Mhm.
And I think, Johnny, you're going to share with us a bit about your history. So I'm not going to go into all of that introductory stuff, which is so amazing. Every time I look at your biohistory, I can't believe all the different things you've done. So we're very grateful. We're grateful that you're leading Pax Christi USA at this time. You certainly didn't pick the easiest time to move into that role. But it seems like I'm very impressed with what's been on the website over the last week or so. It seems like there's a lot going on there. So we're very welcome. We're welcoming you, and we're very pleased. I think we'll probably have a few more people join us as things go along. But I don't want to take up too much of the time here. We have been working and had hoped that with Father Paul and Elizabeth that we were going to have you in person in Portland back on April 28th. That was the original date for our meeting. And so this is a second best, but it's wonderful that we have this technology that we can bring you to Maine. And we hope that in the future, you'll be able to come to Maine in person and appreciate some of the wonderful beauty here and the good community that we have. Meanwhile, welcome Johnny Zokovitch.
Thanks, Denny. And I think Mary Ellen and Denny, you guys wanted people to introduce themselves to start first, or did you want me to jump right in? Whatever you guys want to do is fine with me.
I think we're just going to do a quick say your name and where you're from in Maine. I'll start. I'm Mary Ellen Quinn. I'm in Winterport, which is in the Bangor area, and I'm co-coordinator with Denny for Pax Christi Maine. Welcome, everyone. Pat, I'll call on people if that's easier.
Mary Ellen, if I could interrupt, I just wanted to welcome Pat Hines. It's her first Pax Christi meeting. So I'm Mary Kate Small from Camden.
Great.
I'm Mary Kate.
Hi, Pat.
I'm Pat Hines. I live in Belfast, Maine. This is, as she said, my first visit with Pax Christi. At this point in my life, it's my favorite group. And I'm very happy to be with all of you and to learn what you do and how I can fit into this part of our life.
Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Father Paul.
Well, that's it. Paul Sullivan. I'm the Jesuit pastor of Our Lady of Hope Parish and St. Bridget's School. here in Portland, and delighted to be here and wish we were actually hosting it on premise, but we're here. Thanks.
Ann O'Brien.
Hi, I'm Ann O'Brien from Cutler, and we call that Down East Maine.
Father Frank.
Frank Moran, morning, everybody. I'm retired almost 2 years ago as being a pastor in various parts of Maine, and I'm very happy to reconnect with Pax Christi.
Great to have you.
In Waterville.
Jack Siri.
My name is Jack Siri. I'm from Waterboro, Maine, and my spiritual community is with the Unity of Greater Portland.
Thank you. John.
Wow.
John Kinsler, Portland, Maine, member of Pax Christi and Sacred Heart Church as well here in Portland.
Thank you. Connie.
I'm Connie Jenkins. I live in East Blue Hill, Maine, which is on the Blue Hill Peninsula, about an hour away from Bangor.
Great. Liz. Liz Manning. Thank you.
Okay. Elizabeth or Liz, it doesn't really matter. I'm at the Our Lady of Hope Parish in Portland, Maine, and this is also my first Pax Christi meeting, thanks to Denny.
Welcome.
Nice to meet you, everyone.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Nice to meet you.
Martha and Fred.
I'm Martha Broder.
I'm Fred Broder.
We live in Auburn, Maine. We're part of it. What's the name? Immaculate Heart of Mary.
We keep changing the names.
Sure you are.
Yeah.
Thank you. Elaine.
Elaine McGillicuddy, Portland, Maine. 62 Avalon Road. I'm a member of Sacred Heart St. Dominic's, but I live closer to Sacred,
Come on over.
Stop stealing.
Yeah.
No, inviting.
Right.
Denny, do you want to say where you're from?
Hi, I'm Denny Dreher, and I'm living in Biddeford, Maine, but my heart is elsewhere, partly at Sacred Heart Parish and all of the wonderful community of refugees and immigrants that are part of that community too.
Great. Mary Beth.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth DeMarco. I live in Holton, Maine, which I would say is on the southern end of what we call northern Maine, about 4 hours north of Portland. We have a small Pax Christi group that meets monthly here. And I, for the past few years, have been worshiping with the Episcopalians.
Thanks. And Ferrara.
Well, my automatic pilot is to say I'm from the Bronx.
Uh-huh.
But I have been living here on the Blue Hill Peninsula for about 20 years now. And was very fortunate in the early 80s to be part of Christi, Long Island and Pax Christi, New York, where we did the Stations of the Cross all around Times Square, Grand Central, and that was one of the, I guess, symbols of what's possible when we want to speak about peace.
Okay.
That has kept me involved with Christi.
I'll see you then.
Thank you. Mary Kate.
Hey, Barbie.
Hi. Yeah, I think I said I'm Mary Kate. I'm from Camden, and I'm thrilled to see so many people here today. And Johnny, what a treat!
Mike and Casey.
Hi, I'm Mike.
I'm Casey.
We live in Dedham, Maine, about half an hour out of Bangor, where we are part of the St. Paul the Apostle Parish, and we're new to the council today.
Terrific. Marby.
Hi, I'm Marby Payson from South Portland, and I am an Episcopalian.
All right.
Great. Excellent. Miriam and Nancy.
Hello.
Good morning.
We just got on.
Great to see you.
So we're living in Bangor and part of Pax Christi here.
I forget what your order of sisters are.
We're Franciscans.
Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill,
Good morning.
do you want to introduce yourself?
Am I here?
Yes.
Long-time retired coordinator, Portland, Maine. We're
Thank
here too.
Excellent. And Sally and John.
Hi, Sally Chapel here, and
A lot of people.
we live in Bridgeton, Maine.
Yeah, here.
We live in Bridgeton, Maine, and we've been in Pax Christi, for ever since the Iraq War.
And Ursula, do you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm here. I'm hanging in like everybody else.
Great. So I think we got everyone, and I'm going to ask everyone to mute yourselves so that we'll have an easy time hearing Johnny. So you should have a mute button on your device. Okay, Johnny, we're turning it to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be able to be with y'all today. A couple things getting started is, one, I just really wanted to thank you. That it really was my hope to be in Maine with you in April, and because of everything that's taken place, I'm glad that we're able to do it this way instead, at least. And one of the things that just, it's nice to see some familiar faces. I recognize some of y'all from my long time in Pax Christi, USA, and I really appreciate the introduction from Mary Ellen and from Denny. One of the things that Mary Ellen had mentioned is, that this is a little bit of an unusual time to be starting as the executive director of Pax Christi USA, but it's not unprecedented for me. We have the global pandemic going on right now. When I started originally on staff, I came on staff on September 4th, 2001. So if your minds are doing a little calculation of exactly when that is, that's 7 days before 9/11 took place. And I remember the first time when I was on staff, when I first joined, those first days were spent creating a plan. We were looking at a yearly plan for the next year, and we had been working on it, and we finished it up on September 10th, 2001. So that next morning, all of us gathered together to go over the plan one more time together, and we had the television on as we were having breakfast when we saw, what happened in New York City in the World Trade Center. And so, we took that plan and we realized the world had just changed, and we just, tore it up and we started again. And so when I think about this time and the pandemic and everything that has changed just in these last couple months, I recall that first week that I spent at Pax Christi USA when I came aboard as the communications director. I'm also really glad to do this with y'all today, and my family is as well, because it gives me an excuse to shower and clean myself up a little bit. So we've been on lockdown here for about 8 weeks, and my wife says my hygiene is lacking a little bit. So this gave me a good excuse, a little boost. Anyway, it's good to be with you guys today. By way of introduction, I know that some of y'all know me, but Denny and Mary Ellen had asked me to just start by sharing a little bit about myself. And one of the things that I really wanted to start off with is my background. And if you guys could bear with me 1 second, because we're recording this, I want to make sure that we're getting the right view for how the recording takes place. Okay. I think that will help a little bit. Okay, great. All right, thanks. So for me, in order to introduce myself and in order to talk a little bit about my journey to becoming part of Pax Christi USA, I really have to start with my parents. It was, within the context of being in a particular family and the experiences that my parents had growing up that sort of shaped my own desire to be part of the Catholic peace and justice movement. Now, my parents were not, you know, flaming progressives or liberals or activists by any stretch of the imagination. But their backgrounds, I think, prepared them to raise a child that was particularly sensitive to the issues that we associate with Catholic social teaching. My mom's background is that she was born and lived in poverty all of her childhood. My grandmother had gotten pregnant at the age of 15 in Iowa and had found herself turned out by her family and ultimately living on the streets in Chicago. And my mother went on to, my grandmother went on to have several children. She was the mistress of a minister in the Volunteers of America. It's kind of like the Salvation Army. And so my mom grew up not really knowing her father. They were always the only white family on the quote unquote black side of town. And they lived in just desperate poverty growing up. And it was that experience of poverty that really informed my mom's sensibilities. And I think she passed those on to me as well. They learned the importance of community, and they learned the importance of recognizing how that we are all family across racial lines and cultural lines. My mom's family growing up, her mom and her sisters and her brother, you know, they had to do without, and it was their African-American neighbors that took care of them in such a way that, you know, maintained my grandmother's dignity, that it wasn't about charity and you know, bringing a big box of canned goods over to their house when they knew that they were short on food, but coming over and saying, oh, you know, Thelma, I cooked an extra pie today and I just thought maybe you could use it. And so it would be these small acts of kindness, but the kindness that was kind of sensitive to the dignity of people living in poverty that really mattered a lot to my mom and to her family. And then my father grew up, my grandfather was, he worked 25 years in the coal mines. He worked 25 years in Western Pennsylvania in the coal mines. And after that, he worked 21 years in the steel mills. And I grew up listening to his stories about the union movement and the drive to organize and what it meant to do that kind of work. And I think those stories from my childhood really helped to shape and form who it is that I am today and what it is that attracted me to people like Dorothy Day and Cesar Chavez and Daniel Berrigan eventually. So, you know, growing up, I was surrounded by these stories. And when I went to college, I went to the University of Florida, and it's a state university. And oddly enough, I feel like I got a really good Catholic education at a state university. And part of that was because my mentor there was a professor by the name of Dr. David Hackett. And David had studied under Thomas Keating, the monk in Snowmass, Colorado. And he had also been involved in the Catholic Worker and had been sort of steeped in the Catholic world for a long time. And so the classes that I took at a state university were things like, you know, the life and thought of Thomas Merton. And we took a seminar class on Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker movement, and a spirituality and social justice class where we studied the writings of folks like Henry Nouwen. Other professors that I had at the state university were involved with and connected to liberation theologians. So I learned all about liberation theology as an undergraduate. And I just got this rich understanding of not just, you know, how it is that Catholicism functions in terms of faith and in terms of morality, but how that faith is translated into action in the world, and how that the great context for our faith is to be citizens of the kingdom of God, of the reign of God, and to build up that reign that is marked by justice and mercy and peace and compassion. It was also in college I was first introduced to activism. It was when I went to college, it was 1986, and one of the things that was happening on college campuses at that time was the anti-apartheid movement. And I remember my first protest was to try to get our university to divest. In particular, I think it was from Coca-Cola, which was invested in South Africa, and the divestment movement was going on. I also became really active around homelessness issues. And that is something that sort of, you know, put me on a trajectory in my life where people who are homeless have always been a big part of my life. And I'll share a little bit more about that, you know, going in just a few minutes. But it was these issues, the anti-apartheid movement, working with people who are homeless, and also being active around the death penalty. Florida was a state that practiced capital punishment. And I remember when I was a college student, it was the first time I ever heard of Helen Prejean, and this was before Dead Man Walking. She came and joined us for a march because the college that I went to was just a few miles away from where the state prison was, where executions were held at. So it was in college that I got a good Catholic education, good Catholic social teaching, spirituality and social justice, and also started to engage the issues. But my intersection with Pax Christi came about after I graduated. After I graduated, like a lot of young idealistic students, I wanted to do a year of volunteer service. And I chose to do it with a group called the Catholic Volunteers of Florida. And I was invited to come over to St. Augustine, Florida, and help start what was described as a Catholic worker farm. There was a piece of property in rural St. Augustine that the pastor for the cathedral in St. Augustine had been able to purchase. And he was very moved by the life of Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. And he wanted to start sort of, one of these urban experiments that Peter Marin talked about. So I went over to St. Augustine to help start this farm up. And while I was there, one of my mentors was a woman named Becky Stringer, who headed up Catholic Charities. And she was involved with Pax Christi, Florida. And maybe 2 months after I started that volunteer year, she said, hey, I don't know if you have any interest, but I'm going to be going to a retreat this weekend. And it was with this group, and I'd never heard of it, Pax Christi, Florida, but I had heard of who the retreat leader was. And his name was Dan Berrigan. And I think a lot of you recognize Dan Berrigan's name. And this would start a long relationship that I had with Dan over the years. I never got to know Dan really well, but I saw him a handful of times over about a 20-year period and got to enjoy meals with him and Bible study. And it was that first time going to a Pax Christi, Florida retreat, being invited. And one of the reasons I bring this up because of how important I think it is for folks that are elders in Pax Christi USA and in Pax Christi regions to invite and to mentor and resource young people. It was that invitation from Becky Stringer to come to the retreat when I was a 23-year-old young adult and to meet Dan Berrigan that really made an impression on me that has carried me through and kept me involved in Pax Christi USA all these years. After and following that invitation to the Pax Christi Florida retreat, I got to know Pax Christi more deeply by becoming part of the Young Adult Forum. And I was really involved with a cohort of young adults that were very active from the early 90s all the way through the mid 2000s. And I had the fortune of starting to be a campus minister in the Archdiocese of Miami. And one of the people that I worked under was Tom Cordaro, who was just coming from a stint from being on the staff of Pax Christi USA. And so I got mentored by Tom, and Tom brought me even deeper into the Pax Christi movement, offering me opportunities to connect my faith with, actions of peace and actions of justice in the world, giving me things to read like Walter Wink's Engaging the Power series or Binding the Strong Man by Ched Myers, which led to my own interest in and sort of fascination with the power of story and how it is that our scriptures and the stories of Jesus inform how it is that we practice our discipleship and whether we understand the nonviolence that was central to who Jesus was. So I had all these good experiences right at the beginning of my interaction with Pax Christi USA from elders in the movement who made it possible for me to attend retreats and conferences and gave me the resources that introduced me to who we were. I got involved in doing organizing work for Pax Christi USA before I came on staff with young adults and with campuses. We organized retreats in Florida and in New York, in St. Louis and California, and usually those retreats would gather together anywhere between 75 and about 150 young adults from all over the nation. And I was one of the people on the steering committee that helped to guide the work of the Young Adult Forum and the outreach that we were doing to campuses and young adults during that time. And I was really excited and proud of that work. A lot of young people became involved with Pax Christi USA and have continued to be involved with Pax Christi USA. And when I look back on my time in the movement, that time I really consider to be among the most fruitful because of the numbers of young people that we were able to reach and to bring into the movement. I wrote the campus organizing manual for Pax Christi at that time, And I became really involved both with the School of the Americas and the anti-globalization movement that was taking place. And I helped to organize Pax Christi USA events in both of those contexts. At the SOA in the late 90s, we held 3 events. They were events for students and for young adults to gather prior to the School of the Americas demonstration at Quinania Farms in Americus, Georgia. And we would have upwards of 300 to 500 students from all over the nation who would come in a couple days early from the School of the Americas and for the School of the Americas protest. And they would learn skills, and they would talk about the issues, and they would share best practices on their campuses. And it just was a real hotbed for this kind of, focus on how it is that as young adults and campus leaders, we can do the work of peace and justice in our own particular context. And we spread out those events to take place alongside the things that were happening, for instance, in Seattle in 1999 with the World Trade Organization protest, and then at the World Bank and the IMF in Washington, D.C. in April of 2000, when we gathered, again, a large group of young people prior to those to give them training in Catholic social teaching and how to put that teaching into practice for action and for constructive change. It was also about this same time, in the year 2000, that I started what had been really a dream of my own ever since being introduced to the work of Dorothy Day. I started a Catholic worker house with a few other people in Gainesville, Florida. And it was funny how it started. I was a campus minister, or had been a campus minister the year prior, and we had been doing these Bible studies. And one of the times, we were looking at the scriptures, and one of the students raised their hands and they just said, "This all sounds great. This is just like incredible stuff, that Jesus is talking about, and the things that the disciples are doing. And when Jesus says, go and sell everything that you have and come and follow me and be poor and live among the poor. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that?" And I thought, yeah, why don't we do that? And so we started a Catholic worker in Gainesville, and it was focused on not just outreach and work with people who are homeless and addicted and mentally ill and unemployed, but it also had a special mission to the university, because in Gainesville, the University of Florida was there. And we had a special mission that was also to shape and form young people so that they could enter into lives that were committed to peace and justice, faith and activism beyond their years as a young adult and as a student. And I was part of the Catholic worker community. We were a live-in community, usually anywhere between 8 and 15 of us living in the house at any one time. We were really diverse, old and young, black, brown, and white. I lived there and raised my family there. My 2 younger kids were raised there. And we lived there with people who were homeless, people who struggled with addiction. And it really was probably like the most powerful experience of my life in putting to flesh the message that had been central to everything I understood about what it meant to be Catholic and what it meant to follow Jesus. And I lived at that Catholic worker house for almost 12 years. And as I mentioned, raised my kids there. And during the time that I was there was when I also started working at Pax Christi USA. And I thought this experience of, living in a Catholic worker house and doing, that kind of direct work with people who were sort of the marginalized in society, those that were suffering because of the policies that were being propagated in Washington, D.C., because of the foreign policy decisions our country made, because of the domestic policy priorities that our country made, that it was a really nice yin and yang experience of living in a Catholic worker and being part of that and working for Pax Christi USA, that the two things sort of formed a whole, that they completed one another and they informed the experience that I had at each of those. And it made for a really rich life to be part of those two communities, Pax Christi and the Catholic worker. And I was really happy for the experience of being able to do both of those things at the same time. I mentioned that I joined the staff of Pax Christi USA right after 9/11, and the context for our work for the next decade really took place in the framework of that event and what it yielded in terms of the Iraq War and the bombing of Afghanistan and the kind of war on terrorism footing that our country found itself on and continues to find itself on now. And I started with Pax Christi USA in 2001, and I did a variety of things when I was on staff. Most of you probably know me from my communications work. Shortly after I joined the staff, the communications director left, and Dave Robinson, who was the coordinator at the time, asked me to take over and do the communications work. But I did a variety of things during the almost 15 years that I spent on the national staff in communications, young adult organizing. I was intimately involved with our development work as well as doing, speaking and writing and engaging membership, local and regional group organizing in tandem with people like Phyllis Jepson and Barb Richardson, who I think some of y'all know there in Maine. And it was just a really rich experience to be on the Pax Christi USA staff. But in April of 2016, I made the decision to leave the staff. And part of it was just sort of a nice, I come to a different place in my life. My two kids had both graduated from high school and were sort of launched off into their own, as far as college goes. And my daughter did a year of volunteer service with AmeriCorps. And I looked at it as an opportunity for me to get a little different experience. And I was looking into a variety of different things. I had recently been to the Holy Land and had spent some time in Palestine, in particular in refugee camps, and was entertaining an offer to join and to do work with Palestinian refugees, third and fourth generation Palestinian refugees in the Middle East. But I also was approached at that same time by Pax Christi International. And I had much to do with Pax Christi International in my former position at Pax Christi USA, but I didn't have a whole lot of involvement with a global perspective. Most of my work had been US centric. The impact that the US has on the world is certainly outstated or is for the size of our country, we have an impact that goes well beyond what it should in the rest of the world. But my understanding of global policy had always been filtered through a US-centric lens. And so I thought it would be interesting to work for Pax Christi International to get a sense of what our movement looks like at the international level, and to both work with and experience the stories of people who were doing peace and justice work in places like Kenya, where I was able to travel and to spend some time, and our partners in South Africa. And I spent time in New Zealand and Japan, and just got a stronger sense of how it is that Pax Christi USA is part of a global movement, that we have partners all over the world, that, I often like to use the image from Gulliver's Travels, when the Lilliputians are all trying to hold Gulliver down, that it's not just us, this one small group of people here in the United States throwing our rope over Gulliver, trying to hold him down, trying to hold down empire, but we're part of a group of people, of Lilliputians all over the world, who are throwing their ropes over, trying to hold the giant down. The people in Japan are saying, I'll get the ankle, and we here in the US are trying to get the shoulder down, and people in Africa are trying to get, another part to hold the giant of empire down, to pin it down. And so it was a really, again, incredible experience to hear the stories of people that were working in situations of conflict, like in Africa and like in Central America and South America, especially around extractives and work with indigenous communities. And I just really loved and appreciated the experience at the global level. And I was part of Pax Christi International for just about just short of 4 years on the staff there. And one of the really incredible experiences that I had that I just wanted to share was I was really fortunate during the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I spent time in the north of France with a group of people. There were Europeans from all over the continent, as well as some other guests, who gathered together to mark that 100-year anniversary since the end of World War I. And there was a group of about 25 of us, mainly younger people. I was one of the older ones in the group, in my late 40s, who did a 25-mile walk through the north of France, visiting key places that had seen such death and devastation and destruction, and communities that had been victimized by the terrible violence of World War I, and watching and seeing how those communities marked that time of war, not as a time of glory and with a sort of nationalistic patriot fervor, but rather witnessed that time as a time of death and devastation. And the promise that came out of that war was no, never again war. That those communities that had experienced it firsthand were not glorifying it by any stretch, but rather they were mourning and grieving that violence that had taken place. And one of the key moments that I had during that visit was we spent about an hour in the middle of the night on that same stretch of land where I think it was German, Scottish, and Canadian soldiers had the Christmas ceasefire, where some of you have maybe seen the movie Joyeux Noel. And it was just an incredible, almost mystical experience to be on this ground where in the middle of a war, a ceasefire had grown up around Christmas, and soldiers who had been shooting at each other shared pictures of family members with one another and engaged in games of soccer, of football with one another. And for just a moment, the humanity that is at the center of who all of us are, and the realization that we are not enemies, but one family, how that came together in the middle of this, the carnage and the grief that was World War I on this plot of land, and to be there in the middle of the night with these other people and to mark that moment was just an extraordinary and really life-transforming experience. So again, I was at Pax Christi International for just about 4 years, and I was really excited when I saw that there was the opportunity to return to Pax Christi USA. And I've been in this position now at Pax Christi USA. I started at the beginning of October, and so had a little bit of time before the pandemic hit to get myself oriented a little bit, to talk a little bit with our staff, some changes were needing to be made because we had people who were set to leave the staff, and I needed to put together a new staff and whatnot. But I've been back in this position as the executive director now at Pax Christi USA for just a few months. And most of our work has been really determined by what's happened here in the last couple months. The framework for that has been the coronavirus pandemic. And I want to say a little bit about that. But before I get there, I know that Mary Ellen and Denny had asked me to also just share a little bit about Pax Christi USA for anybody who's on the call that's not familiar with Pax Christi USA. So just really briefly, I wanted to share a little bit about Pax Christi USA. And in particular, one of the things that I became aware of, that I was aware of when I took this position as the executive director, is that Pax Christi is getting ready to celebrate our 50th anniversary here in the United States. That we started in 1972 with a small group of dedicated, primarily lay Catholics, people like Eileen Egan and Gordon Zahn, who some of you might know he was the one who popularized the story of Franz Jägerstätter, which is made into a movie by Terrence Malick this past fall, A Hidden Life. But it was people like Egan and Zahn who joined together, and with other lay Catholics like Joe Fahey, but also bishops like Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, and decided that we wanted to form a section of Pax Christi International here in the United States. And they had that meeting in 1972, and one of the people that was there advising them in this work was Dorothy Day. Over the course of these almost 50 years that Pax Christi USA has been around, there's been an ebb and flow to the work. I think looking back on our history, anti-nuclear work, nuclear disarmament, really dominated those early years in the 70s and the 80s. Although the people who were part of our movement came from all different backgrounds. They were part of the civil rights movement. They were part of the farm worker struggle, certainly part of the anti-war movement that grew up around Vietnam. In the 80s and into the 90s, Pax Christi USA's work really spread, from just being, or not being, but primarily being around nuclear disarmament, to also embracing the issues that were taking place in Central America, in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala, and the solidarity work that was done across national boundaries with those communities in Central America and Haiti as well. And so Pax Christi USA really took on international solidarity work. And one of the interesting things that happened in the early 90s was that for a lot of peace groups, there was a crisis of identity that kind of arose from the work that, from the fact that the Cold War ended, that this axis of understanding within peace work that had been based on the models of the axis of war and peace, or the axis of East-West relations, had really changed. And peace groups needed to, I think, figure out how to be in the world in a really different context than the Cold War context. And when Pax Christi took on those questions of identity, it meant doing a deeper dive into the spirituality of nonviolence. It meant becoming a more multi-issue organization and recognizing that at the local level and the national level, there were other issues calling out for the witness of Catholic social teaching and the Catholic peace and justice movement. It meant the practice of intersectionality long before we knew what that word meant, that everything was connected, that there was a nexus where all of the issues that we look at somehow came together and were intimately connected to one another. And it showed the development of Pax Christi USA's 4 major priorities that we still use today: the spirituality of nonviolence and peacemaking, disarmament and demilitarization and reconciliation with justice, economic and interracial justice, and the search and the struggle for human rights and global restoration. That those 4 priorities came out of that early 90s identity crisis that came with the end of the Cold War. The 90s also saw, a time for Pax Christi USA to really explore what has been ultimately, I think, contextualized as America's original sin, racism, and how it is that white privilege and white supremacy impacts the institutions that make up the United States, and that a group like Pax Christi is not immune to that. And so this major criticism of Pax Christi USA, that when we did a survey in 1995, we found out that our membership was overwhelmingly white, 95% white, and yet we were part of a church that was becoming more and more diverse every single year. And so what did that mean for us? And for Pax Christi USA, what it meant was to enter into a 20-year commitment to becoming an anti-racist, multicultural organization. And it wasn't this idea that we were going to treat racism as another issue alongside disarmament, or alongside immigration, or alongside foreign policy or militarism. But it meant rather that we would use the lens of anti-racism to look at all of our work. How is it that our work was either promoting or adding to or perpetuating racism? How were our structures doing that? How were our policies doing that? How were the ways and practices that we had always conducted ourselves contributing to those divisions that happen along racial lines and continuing to perpetuate white supremacy in the world? So we made a commitment, a 20-year commitment, that was just, that 20-year commitment ended this past year, 2019. And I was really proud that Pax Christi USA was one of the first in the Catholic peace and justice world, certainly one of the first in the Catholic world altogether, to tackle anti-racism and to talk about the impact that it has on our work, and how that we need to free ourselves from that demon and heal our organization and heal the larger world in terms of racial reconciliation, racial justice, and the pursuit of racial equity. I also wanted to say a little bit, that Mary Ellen and Denny had passed me on some questions that you guys had asked. And I'm going to get to those in just a second, but they also asked for a little bit of the context of Pax Christi International for folks that don't know. And I had mentioned that I was on the staff of Pax Christi International. And for me in particular, it was a real eye-opener to see how embedded we are in a movement that goes well beyond the US, and to be moved and inspired by the things that had taken place, that take place within our global movement every day. Pax Christi International started as a reconciliation movement between German and French Catholics, who at the end of World War II looked across their country's boundaries at one another and said, we've slaughtered each other by the millions twice now in a 30-year period. And yet we say we share the same faith. What is wrong with that? What is wrong with us? How is that happening? And so it was French and German Catholics reaching out to one another, saying again, echoing those words, or those words being echoed by the popes later on, no more war, no more war, never again between us. We share a faith. We are part of the same family. Let us reconcile one another and make sure that this doesn't happen. The Pax Christi International Network started in Europe, but it's really grown to encompass the whole world. There's 120 member organizations in 60 countries on 5 continents. And the richness of that experience informs who we are as Pax Christi USA as well. And one of the really interesting things that I want to share with you about that is that here in the United States, we often look around and we see and we think of ourselves as being a graying movement, that we are mainly older folks here in the United States. And there's truth to that. And I hope that we can, sort of replenish our numbers and re-energize our movement by appealing to young people. But one of the things I want to tell you about Pax Christi International is that it is overwhelmingly young. It is young people who are part of the Pax Christi International movement around the world. The people in the Democratic Republic of Congo who are doing this work are all in their teens and in their 20s. The people that gathered together from 8 Latin American countries in May of 2018 to talk about how their indigenous communities were fighting extractive industries within their communities were overwhelmingly between the ages of 20 and 40. Whenever I traveled with Pax Christi International, that was one of the things that just it was incredibly exciting to feel the vibrancy of young people all around the world taking ownership for the peace and justice work that's taking place often in areas of incredible conflict, whether it's intertribal conflict in Africa or whether it's conflict around extractive industries in Latin America, that it's young people that are rising up and that are the bulk of the movement of Pax Christi International around the world. The other thing I just want to mention about the work of Pax Christi International too, because I think it impacts the work that we're going to be doing here in the United States, is the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that some of you might be familiar with. We opened up a conversation with the Vatican in 2015 about the centrality of gospel nonviolence to the experience of being Catholic. And we've continued to have a dialogue with the Vatican. We were influential. We were able to convince Pope Francis to dedicate the 2017 World Day of Peace to the message of nonviolence. And one of the things that I hope that all of you are really proud of is that the Pope does not write his own stuff often. He's got his contributions, but things are often written for him. And Pax Christi was invited to write that World Day of Peace message. And what we heard that was delivered by him on January 1st, 2017, was about 75 to 80% of what we had turned in as context for that speech that he gave, all around nonviolence, about nonviolence being what underpins the politics of peace. And so this work around nonviolence that's happening at the global level in conversation with the Vatican, and that we're hoping will transform the way the church looks at nonviolence and embraces at every level, the sacramental level, the parish level, the educational level, nonviolence as a central tenet of our Catholicism, is really rich work that's taking place right now. So I realize that I have talked a whole lot right here and thrown out a lot of information, and I know it was a lot to cover, and I'm glad that Mary Ellen and Denny had asked me to cover those things, a little bit about myself, Pax Christi USA and Pax Christi International. But I also wanted to really spend some time in answering some of the questions that you had and having a little bit of a conversation here. So if it's okay, Mary Ellen and Denny, I've got a list of the questions that people have sent in, but I thought maybe we could take a break from hearing me and maybe open it up and let other folks, raise some of those questions themselves, and we can have a little bit of a conversation. Does that sound okay, Mary Ellen and Denny? Great. All right, so maybe the way that we'll do this, again, I think for people to keep themselves on mute when they're not talking, it helps with us not having ambient noise in the background. But maybe if I could just kind of open it up and ask folks who are on the call, if there's somebody who does have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand up, and unmute yourself and I'll call on people. You can unmute yourself and ask your question, and we can talk a little bit about that. Does that sound okay to folks? Okay, great. Does anybody want to start us off? Mary Kate.
Hi, hi, Johnny. This isn't a question so much as I just wanted to tack on something about you. And that is, I've had the pleasure of being on the National Council for the past 3 years. My term is coming up, done in October, September, October. And when we were without an executive director, there was a group that was working on finding one. And then when Johnny was announced, I just can't tell you the thrill, people were so happy about Johnny. And I've come to Pax Christi from the outside, really. And so I didn't have the pleasure of knowing, except seeing him in my email box periodically, when he was communications director. But I just wanted to tell some of the people who are new, newer, if they don't know you, that everyone was really thrilled when Johnny got picked. And so there you go.
Thanks, Mary Kate. Very kind of you. Yeah, one thing I'll just say about that is, again, knowing a little bit about my story that y'all just heard, is Pax Christi really is family to me. That Pax Christi USA shaped who I am. It informed the experience that I've had as a Catholic who believes and wants to follow the nonviolent Christ in the world. And so coming back to Pax Christi USA after spending some time at Pax Christi International, to me, it's a coming home experience. It's a homecoming. I love Pax Christi USA, and I'm really excited about what we have to do over these next few years. I like the idea that we're going to be celebrating 50 years in 2022, and that should be a moment to revisit our legacy and talk about all that we have done together for 50 years. But it should also be a time about talking about how are we going to pass this movement on to new generations? How are we going to invigorate the experience, the flame that young people have for peace and justice work within the Catholic Church, and pass that on and mentor and shape them so that Pax Christi USA has another 50 years of relevancy going away from 2022. That really, really excites me. And I know coming to Pax Christi USA as a young person, 23-year-old, back in, I guess it was 1992 or so, 91, 92, that it was the experience of older folks that invited me into this movement, that gave me the resources to understand my own experience of faith and spirituality and how that's related to my discipleship to Jesus in the world, in acting for mercy and compassion and peace and justice, how important that was. And I think we're primed to do that again and to make a commitment. And that's one of the primary goals during my time as executive director that I want to put front and center, is the outreach that we have to young adults and to recommitting to campus organizing. Other questions or comments that people have? Elaine? You have to unmute yourself, Elaine.
I just want to thank you for this rich, you've had such amazing experiences. And I didn't know about the young people now, nowadays, the world, what you told us about, many of them are younger. I didn't know that. And your history is just amazing. I just want to thank you for sharing it. And I'm really glad that you're our Pax Christi USA head. And you've been at it a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. I really appreciate that. And if I could just share like a really brief story about one of those groups, one group of young people that I got to work with while I was at Pax Christi International was a group of young men and women in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And some of y'all that keep up with African issues might know that they've been going through a time of elections and transition of power over the last few years. And there's been a great deal of violence that has grown up around that political milieu, so much so that the elections at one point, I think it was in 2016 or 2017, were disallowed, the results of it, because of the violence that took place. And there was a group of young people that were attached to Pax Christi International. It's a group called Africa Reconciled, that decided that in anticipation of the 2018 elections, they were going to train young people in nonviolent intervention to keep the violence from happening during the election, so that people would feel safe to go out to vote, that they would feel safe in exercising their agency as part of their society. And they trained over 5,000 young people over the course of a period of about a year and a half to be able to intervene and to help folks feel, to dissipate any conflict that arose during that time, and to be able to lay the groundwork so that people felt that they could exercise their agency and participate in the political process. And the kind of violence that many of our young communities are experiencing, and it's often a choice between being part of extremist violence in some of these countries or being victims of violence, and finding that middle way and embodying nonviolence as a force for constructive change, whether it's in the Philippines, or whether it's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or whether it's in indigenous communities in Peru. It's a powerful witness that Pax Christi International has there. And it's mainly young people. Thanks, Elaine.
No, what part of Africa? Because we have Africans from the Congo in our parish, Sacred Heart St. Dominic.
Yeah, we've got Pax Christi International actually has a program that is centered on the Great Lakes region of Africa. It's Burundi, it's the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda, where this nonviolence education is taking place. And my colleague at Pax Christi International, his name is Dudene Serakabuza. He is the primary organizer for our African work. He's based in Brussels, but he goes back and forth between the Great Lakes region of Africa to help, facilitate these trainings around nonviolence that are aimed at young people and aimed at raising a generation of young people that know nonviolence and can respond in nonviolent ways, so that the sort of cycle of violence that has taken place in so many African countries and in locations in Africa can be broken. And part of the model for that is what we saw in the Philippines in the 1980s. The Catholic Church in the 70s and the 80s trained young people in the Philippines for a whole generation of people to be ready for that moment when they could overthrow the Marcos regime in a nonviolent way. And it was the Catholic Church and Cardinal Sin who was, understood the power of nonviolence to make constructive change in the society, but that people needed to be trained and they needed to be educated. And the church took that on as their responsibility. Would that the church would take that responsibility on in every country.
Johnny?
Yeah, Bill?
I'm part of a largely disappeared generation of a disappearing church. How do we reach these young people in our parish and in the city who are very much disaffected from the church?
No, I think that's a great question, Bill. And, part of it, I think, is that for young people, there's two questions, I think, there that you asked. One is that there's a certain segment of people that, everything that has happened within our church, they're not coming back. They're not going to be part of it. They're fed up with the abuse. They're fed up with the lack of transparency. They're fed up with the corruption that has happened with our church. And
the clericalism.
And the clericalism. And we have to recognize that. And we have to recognize that, our church created that for itself. But there's a whole nother group of young people that have sort of tenuous bonds with the church, that they don't identify the church necessarily with the institution, but they identify the church, like I did as a young person, with the witness of people like Oscar Romero and Dorothy Day, and that's their Catholicism. I had a young person come up to me a couple months ago, and they identified themselves. They knew I was the director of Pax Christi USA, and they said, I'm Catholic, but I'm not Catholic. And I was like, well, puzzle that out for me a little bit. And they're like, I'm tired of the institutional church. I'm tired of what's happening there. I don't go to church. But Catholicism is a language and a way of looking at the world for me. And, I'm not Catholic, but I think I might be a Pax Christi Catholic. And I say, yeah, that sounds right to me. That sounds right. And there are young people still have, I believe, like Dorothy Day said, a hunger for the heroic, but they need to see those witnessing communities that inspire them. And if they don't see it in their parish and they don't see it in their diocese, they need to see it in other places. They need to see it in local manifestations of the church that are happening, that are still maybe tied to the parish, but are not the whole parish itself. They're Catholic worker communities. They're intentional communities. There's small groups of people that recognize that their faith is driving them to be in solidarity with the homeless in their community, to combat white supremacy, to work and to locate themselves with immigrant communities. That what young people want and what young people respond to is witness. It's the witness value that I think attracts young people to our work. And it's being able to do that and to do it in a way that is visible, that I think will inspire young people to reconnect with us, especially when they know that it's connected in some way with that spirituality, with the tradition of the church. Dan Berrigan said this to me once, and I think it's the truest thing I've ever heard, is he told me a story. The Catholic worker that I was part of, we modeled ourselves on the Los Angeles Catholic worker. And the Los Angeles Catholic worker, Jeff Dietrich and Catherine out there, put out an appeal one year that said, we hope that you'll support us. We know that for many of you, we continue to do this work on the margins of the church. And Dan wrote them a scathing letter back in the best Dan Berrigan-ish way, which said, of course I support you. Of course, I think the work you are doing wonderful, but I take issue with you locating yourselves on the margin of the church. What you are doing is at the center of the church. And I believe that about the work that Pax Christi USA does, about the work that Catholic worker communities do. We're not on the margins of the church. We are at the center of the church because we embody that message, which is at the heart of Jesus's teaching, the gospel of nonviolence, the power of mercy and justice and peace. And when we embody that, no matter how small we are, we locate ourselves at the center of the church. So this idea of being witnessing communities, and I think that that's the inspiration that young people will draw from Pax Christi USA. And then the other part of that, and I'll be really honest, I know that, we're primarily here a group of folks, that are in later generations, that we're not young adults necessarily on this call. But I think that it's really important for us as people that are that are part of the first and second generations of Pax Christi USA, to recognize that once upon a time we had the space to be able to carve out our agenda and to be able to set the agenda for our movement. And that it's really important for us to allow young people to be able to carve out those spaces themselves as well. That it's not just about adopting our agenda or our way of doing things, but it's about us helping to give them a space where they can do things the way they do them, where they can talk about things the way they talk about them. I think we offer a rich experience of a rich cross-generational experience, but young people also need to be able to control their own agendas, and they need to be able to do their practices, and they need to do it with our support, even if we don't always agree with everything they do or the way that they do it. And I think that's one of the things that I hope to create in Pax Christi USA, is that we have lots of spaces where people can exercise engagement according to their gifts, according to their status in life, to the place that they are in their experience. And young people need that. And I think for us as older folks, it means loosening up the agenda a little bit and letting them take some leadership, letting them call the shots as well, and giving mentoring and resourcing them to be able to do that work.
What are some examples of effective witnessing, particularly that appeals to the young?
Yeah, I think one of the great witnesses that Pax Christi USA communities have been doing is identifying themselves as allies with communities that are threatened by some of the foreign and domestic policies of our time. So for instance, Pax Christi communities that identify with immigrants right now, that is a really rich experience of a witnessing community. When we locate ourselves, not just as people that support comprehensive immigration reform and justice for immigrants, but rather that we identify ourselves as allies that will put our, our time, our bodies, our money at the support of groups of immigrants that are fighting for justice in the way that Pax Christi groups did for farm workers a generation ago. I think Pax Christi Florida has a rich experience of solidarity, not with, one of the things that I heard about Pax Christi USA when I first got involved in the 90s, and I heard this from marginalized communities in the United States, was, yeah, Pax Christi USA is great, but all your solidarity work takes place with people overseas. And Pax Christi USA did. They had rich experiences with people in Central America and the Philippines and Haiti and whatnot. But these communities were saying, we're right here. We're on the other side of the tracks. Build solidarity with us as well. So Pax Christi USA communities that have built solidarity with groups like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, farm workers in Florida, that Pax Christi Florida has been really intentional about building a bridge with, so that they can support their work and so that they can be. One of the great experiences that I had was the Coalition of Immokalee Workers when they were recognized by the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Foundation with an award maybe about 10 years ago or so. They could invite 4 guests, and one of their guests was Pax Christi USA, because we had been there at the beginning with them, supporting the work that they had done, not asking them necessarily to come and be part of our organization to support the work that we were doing and show up for our stuff, but we showed up for their stuff. And it's built a relationship that doesn't bear fruit necessarily immediately, but it bears fruit down the line, because it identifies Pax Christi USA as a group that is an ally of groups that are made up of people that are experiencing injustice firsthand and directly in our nation today. So I think that's a good example, Bill. And it's good to hear from you, Bill. It's been a long time. Other comments or questions folks have?
Yeah.
Denny.
I have one.
Whoops.
No, go ahead.
Denny and then Father Paul. You need to unmute yourself, Denny.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I've been thinking, as you told us your story, and as I think about young people today in this country, those of us who are in the white supremacy class, the similarity between that story and the story of international groups. I mean, that we are, most of us, I mean, I grew up in a family where my mother's, parents from Ireland, and they worked very hard, and her mother died when she was very young. We grew up in the Bronx in New York. And then we moved to New Jersey. And when I finally, I never got the message. I mean, I was very active with young Christian students, and I used to do talks and go around with that. And then we lived in Massachusetts, and I came to Maine. And gradually over the years, I became so disaffected. I mean, I remember literally walking out of church during Mass one time in tears, because I said, they're not talking, the homily, nothing is talking about the relevant, what's relevant, what's going on in the world. And my struggle, I did leave, and I joined the Quakers for a number of years. And it was during that time when I remember, again, the Quakers that I was encountering were people who were gray heads, who were down doing witnessing, and and I remember asking at one point, how is it you've been doing this, whatever they said, 30, 40 years, witnessing at Raytheon down in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And they just said, but we just have to do it, we just have to keep at it, we have to persevere. And it was finally what brought me back to the Catholic Church was Pax Christi, when Mother Jim Gower came and did a presentation, and Marby, hello there, Marby and I attended the first meeting of that group that became Pax Christi Portland as representatives from the American Friends Service Committee. We were very involved with the Nuclear Freeze campaign. And, it took a long while to gradually feel oh, there are other people in the church that feel the way we do, that care about these things. But now there's such a diversity among, well, young people have so many choices. They can get involved with peace action, with this, there's 95 different groups. And so how is it, if we're not getting the message out within the church community per se, then how do these young people, how can they be inspired to join Pax Christi or to be involved or to see this as part of the church's mission if that's not what is being experienced by them? And I'm not saying everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first met Father Frank Morin, I think it was in Philadelphia at the National Pax Christi meeting, and he had been down in Bolivia for some years. And I thought, oh, he's from Maine? This is amazing, But that witness is not been present easily. What do you have to say about that, Johnny?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, Denny, and I think you raise up a good point. And one of the things that I would say is that like there's an orientation that we can have, I think, to parish life. And the expectation often is that, parish life that the parishes are places where we experience community, where we experience, and we experience the sacraments, and it ends up becoming a place where we get fed. And I think that if you find a good parish, yeah, that's exactly what happens. But often parishes aren't like that. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be part of those parishes, I think. I think rather it's a matter of switching our orientation. And it's seeing ourselves as to me, relationships are so important on every level. And even if parishes themselves are not places where a parish itself is not a place where we particularly are fed, we can find that elsewhere, like you did, Denny, for a while with the Quakers or with another group or something like that. But what we should look at parishes as being is that they're seed beds. They're places where we're called to be prophetic. They're not places where we're necessarily fed, depending on the kind of parish it is. And again, I want to accentuate, like I go to a parish, I love my parish. My priest preaches the gospel of peace and justice. My priest, witnesses to a model that is inclusive of women and inclusive of people who are not, ordained clergy. And it's powerful. And there's lots of parishes I knew that are doing incredible stuff. But if we're not able to be a part of those parishes, what I would say is to cultivate an orientation that the parish that we're close to is a place where we're called to preach the prophetic message of Jesus at, that we need to still be present there in some way, that we need to maintain relationships, that it's mission ground for Pax Christi USA folks, that there are people there that this message will resonate with, but they'll never hear it if we're not still part of it in some way. And I look at religious, as a person who worked at a parish for a while, I know that religious education directors, people that do RCIA, that, even the secretary or the receptionist, these are gatekeepers in parishes. And if we build relationships with those folks on a personal level, they help give us access to other people within those parishes. Religious education directors need people to come in and talk about Catholic social teaching at least once a year. The RCIA, if they've got the experience, like you're saying with Father Frank Morin, if they know that they have a resource person who has this experience of working in Bolivia and what that meant in terms of, his own personal discipleship to Jesus and living out the gospel call, like that's a rich experience for them to share with other people in RCIA. So I think that if we can, sometimes, if we don't have the experience of a parish where we ourselves can be fed at, if we can flip the tables and think of it as mission ground for us as Pax Christi USA and still maintain a relationship in some way, I think that that's important for us to do and to think about.
I think one of the things that I find is that I happen to be in a wonderful parish now. It's not because of the clerical leadership or what, it's because of the community. And as we've mentioned, that it's 75% at least African asylum seekers and Latin American, particularly Central American folks. The community is rich, but those people are so afraid. If they're an asylum seeker, they're so afraid to participate in something or be seen as, they might be deported.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to build honest relationships. I mean, we share, there's a few people that you can share with, but it's a very difficult time for people. I mean, we do a lot of work with immigrants. We have a food pantry. And I was so, during this time, the first people who called me to see how I was were 3 of our African, members of the community.
Yeah.
But it's a very, everything is divisive these days, it seems. And also within the church. And again, with the clustering of parishes and the fact that we have like 5 churches in our cluster.
Mm-hmm.
The priests that are there are running ragged. I mean, they can't be the shepherds. They can't have the time and the relationship with people. And but it's also difficult because of the way that so many parishes are structured, that we have no authority.
Yeah.
The lay people don't have the opportunity to bring forth their gifts in a way that would benefit. And so we're struggling. And any comments about that or from anyone else would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things there I would say, Denny, again, is my own experience is, yeah, if you can find a place that you belong to and that you're fed at, that's great. If you can't, and you can flip the script a little bit and look at it as mission ground, that's great. And if you can't do either of those things, I think one of the things, for instance, that young people hunger for today is the experience of community, even if it doesn't take place within the institution itself. So for us to do, I loved that base community model of Latin America. I had the experience of being in Mexico with Samuel Ruiz's diocese back in the mid-90s. And the experience of people gathering together, lots of them were attached to the church, but there were towns that had no church, and they gathered together in people's homes and there was no priest, but they broke open the word together and they celebrated a meal. And so for us, if we're not finding that within parish life, to continue to build our own communities that we are part of, and for those communities to be outward looking, that they're not just, for us to gather and meet and talk amongst each other, but that we embrace opportunities to witness together when we have that, when we can do that. We show up for a protest. We show up and we support, an immigrant family when they come into our community. We, to find those ways to witness to the world as well, I think are important. I think the base community model, to me, most people's Pax Christi local groups, what they really are is their church. It's the place where they experience church at. They can't experience it in their parish anymore. They haven't been able to find, a good priest like the ones we've got on this call, who understand the centrality of Jesus's gospel message of nonviolence and are preaching that gospel. They're not able to find a diocese where they feel valued at. And so they've created their own church and they call it a Pax Christi local group. But what they do is they celebrate the sacraments together. They gather together and they break bread. What they do is they educate each other and each other's children by witnessing to what it means to try to be authentic disciples of Jesus in the world today. It's churches taking place in Pax Christi local groups, whether they call themselves a church or not. And some of them do. They recognize this is my church. And they say that really, straightforwardly. I don't think there's any easy answers, Denny. It's a question I think a lot of us are wrestling with. Thanks. Father Paul, I think you had a comment or a question.
Just an observation as a sort of new passerby here. I mean, I was aware of Pax Christi, had heard of it for years. Until Denny arrived on the doorstep, I was not aware of anything particular that was going on in the Portland area, or was hoping to go on in the Portland area. But I just want to say this. I've been connected with several other groups or associations that were graying out and would sit around and lament that, how do we get young people? But the meetings tended to be sitting around lamenting, how do we get young people, and tended to be fairly disorganized, and nothing really was going on. My sense is that young people are not going to come to anything like that. And if you want to attract them, you have to have something going on. Pax Christi is doing this. Would you like to be part of it? Now, once they get in the door, yes, they may have their own ideas, and as you said, they need to be listened to. And so, it becomes their organization, not just their grandparents' organization. But here in Portland, we're sitting next to two significant college campuses, USM and UNE, and we're half an hour away from the only Catholic higher education institution in the state of Maine, the diocese. I just, again, I'm speaking in ignorance, but it seems if we were able to pull together a couple of specific, very specific things in the name of Pax Christi Maine or Pax Christi Portland or whatever, that would have a chance of, being advertised on these campuses and attracting people. Because those young people are mostly not in church, at least not in my parish. We see a few, but not many. But we have to go where they are. That's all I'd say. I'm very open to be welcoming and to be encouraging and part of it. I love it. But to me, that's the kind of angle that we need to look at.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Father Paul. And one of the things that I have recommended to Pax Christi, groups that ask about, getting young people involved is it's not a broad approach. It's not a scattershot approach. What you need to do is you need to find one or two charismatic young people that believe in the same message that we all believe in around the gospel of nonviolence. And you need to empower them like Paul and Silas, to go out and to preach the good news in the communities that they are a part of. There is no substitute for peer-to-peer invitations. I'm a 51-year-old man. I can invite as many 21-year-olds as, every 21-year-old I meet over the course of the day to come to a Pax Christi group, and they're never going to come. But if I'm good for, if there's one that I build a good relationship with, and then they invite the other 21-year-olds they know, then they come. They come for that. And I also, it's funny, when I was a campus minister, if I just advertised like a meeting about peace and justice stuff or a Pax Christi group meeting, I got hardly anybody at those things. And so what I started to do, because I have a love of scripture, is I started doing Bible study. And that's how the students that I worked with got radicalized. They got radicalized by reading the scripture. That's where it happened. It wasn't a peace and justice group meeting. It was, we broke open the scripture and they started to say, how come Jesus talks about money all the time? Why does Jesus spend all his time with people who are outcasts? And we started talking about what that means, that Jesus did that. And if we're going to be followers of Jesus, what does it mean for us then? So I think that, I think the two things I recommend is like investing in one or two young people. Like if I was part of Pax Christi Maine, I'd want to keep my eye out for that one or two young, I'm sure that occasionally there's a young person that comes across your radar. So who are those people? When they come across, empower them to be your Paul and Silas and reach out to other young communities. We ourselves at our age can't do it in a way that they can. So reaching out and identifying and empowering a few young people to be able to build that up and then giving them the resources to do it. They have a group of 10 friends that want to do a retreat, underwrite it for them. Get everybody in the community that's on this call to chip in $20 so that they've got a budget that they can buy dinner for their next 8 times when they gather together. That kind of thing. And let them do their thing and let them, and when it becomes the right time, you introduce yourself to the larger group, ask them for a cross-generational type, cross-pollinating type thing, to happen. But I think finding that one or two people to act as sort of the primary people to animate the work of young adult and campus organizing that are of that cohort, nothing replaces that. And then the other thing to me is find that thing where that young people might be interested in that's not necessarily has a peace and justice focus, but yourself takes people into peace and justice work, looking at Jesus more closely, studying the history of the church more closely. Those types of things, invite deeper experience or engagement with the issues that we are, most profoundly influenced by. It's a really good point, Father Paul. Thanks. I know we're also starting to bump up here to 11:30, and so I want to observe whatever Mary Ellen and Denny, you guys kind of tell me what we're doing here as we go along.
Our plan
Sorry.
plan was to end at 12:30. It's never enough time once we get into good discussion and have ideas and have a lot of passion for this work and what we can do going forward. If you, Johnny, wanted to share a reflection or a prayer, and then we have a final closing song to share, which is Make Me a Channel of Your Peace, which is always our ongoing prayer for ourselves and our communities. But
Yeah.
that's where we're at.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. Yeah, I've got a short prayer maybe to bring our time to a close together. And I also want to say, especially during this time of the pandemic, you know I spent a lot of time sort of giving background information about myself and Pax Christi and stuff. If we want to do a deeper dive into anything, going forward, if these lockdowns and stay-at-home orders continue, I would be glad to get on another call with you guys or with a group of you guys at any point to dive deeper into something that you're most interested in. I really miss during this time. My plan as executive director was to be out and on the road, because I believe that the work of Pax Christi USA takes place at the local level. It takes place in local communities. And I really hoped to be out there with you and meeting you in your homes and whatnot. So unfortunately, I'm meeting people through Zoom instead, but I'm always glad to do that if you guys want to do anything, moving forward. So this is a reflection. Some of you may have seen it yesterday. Yesterday was International Conscientious Objectors Day. And Sister Diana Ortiz, some of you may recognize her name. She was a sister who was in Guatemala and had the experience of being herself. She's a torture survivor, and she's the deputy director on the Pax Christi USA staff. And she put together a short reflection for a prayer study action e-bulletin that we sent out over our email network. And if you're not on our email list, feel free to send me your information, or Mary Ellen Quinn, or to Denny, and I'd be glad to add you to our email list. And it goes like this. Let me just ask you first to just take a moment of silence and to think for a moment of one or two people, peacemakers. Maybe they were conscientious objectors. Maybe they were people that introduced you to peace. Maybe they are historical figures that stood up for peace and justice and modeled nonviolence. Call to mind those people, just silently for a second. And as I read this prayer below, I just invite you to be considering how it is that the witness of the people that you're thinking of can help to inspire you to walk the way of peace during this pandemic crisis. How might these peacemakers guide you to listen to your conscience and to reimagine a future that is no longer entangled in the armlock of injustice? God of peace, in the dawning and sunset of our days, you invite us to become peace seekers. Be our conscience in the dawning and sunset of our days. Be our conscience as we seek to listen and to trust your voice within. Be our conscience as we remember conscientious objectors who chose a path of nonviolence. Be our conscience as we tackle the underlying causes of war and violence. Be our conscience as we seek to find ways to support those impacted by today's pandemic. Be our conscience as we discern how to love both our neighbors and our enemies. Be our conscience as we seek to embrace justice, promote reconciliation, and build peace. Be our conscience as we make informed decisions for the common good. Be our conscience as we build communities of joy and love. And be our conscience as we dare to reimagine a world free of injustice and free of hatred. Amen.
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 I think what we can do is we'll gather in song, and then at the very end, Johnny, you can unmute everyone and we could share some gratitude. And in advance of that, I certainly, Denny and I and all of us on the call want to thank you so much for sharing your time and your passion and giving us some good ideas for going forward and expanding.
Thanks.
So we'll do our, if everyone stays on mute except for Ann, our music minister, and myself, and then please sing at home. Use your voices. We're, as they say, we're kind of together but separate. All right, Ann.
Okay, can you hear this? Okay.
Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, only light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. Oh, Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to know, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. In giving of ourselves that we receive. And in dying that we're born to eternal life. Do you want to unmute everyone, Johnny?
Yeah, I did. Only people who are still muted are people who just muted themselves after I unmuted us.
Oh, okay.
Which rebels.
All right,
Follow
I
directions.
think everybody's unmuted now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, guys. It's really nice to see everyone.
It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much, Johnny.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye now.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Mary Ellen and Denny.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you,
Mary Beth, thank you for your
Johnny.
services
Bye-bye.
as secretary.
Yes.
We'll send it.
How was your first meeting, Pat?
Terrific.
All right.
Johnny, do you ever see Phyllis Jepson?
I do. I talked to her last week, actually, Bill.
I nominated her for her first national office
Ah,
about 30
I'll-
years ago.
I'll remind her of that.
Well, she remembers. She remembers. Yeah. Did you meet any Millers in the Catholic worker movement in Florida?
Oh, yeah.
Huh?
What was the question, Bill?
Did you meet any Millers?
Any Millers? I don't think so. We were the only Catholic worker house in Florida when I was there. It's since closed. I left. I'm actually in St. Louis, Missouri now. That's why I was saying 11:30 earlier. I'm an hour earlier than you guys.
St. Louis, Missouri. That's where I was in the convent in the novitiate.
Bill Miller, who wrote the first Dorothy Day biography.
Oh, you know, I did meet Bill Miller once. I met him. He came to a Pax Christi, Florida retreat for us.
He's my godson.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And one of his sons was involved with a Catholic worker in Florida.
Oh my gosh, I wonder who it was.
Which one? Could have been Christopher. I'm not sure.
He
Which
might
one?
have. He might have gotten involved after I left too. I started the house, but I left in 2013.
Yeah, I don't. He may have been gone by then too.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know,
Bye-bye.
this might be an opportunity. I've never been able to get a person from our parish to attend a Pax Christi meeting. And I was wondering, perhaps I will be able to share this meeting with my parishioners via, can we be